One. Fluff. Edna first noticed the fluff when she was rolling up the sleeping bags at the end of a 3-day stay at a provincial park. She was in the boys' tent, rolling up the bags, wondering whether it would be necessary to clean them this time round, or whether maybe they could wait another season, when she saw it. A small, nondescript clump of fluff. It was almost so insignificant among the general mess that she nearly missed it. But when the little clump did catch her notice, she remembered it because she wondered whether one of the sleeping bags or maybe one of the pillows had sprung a leak. She didn't bother to check any seams just then and likely would have forgotten the fluff had she not noticed even more fluff in her and Gavin's tent. There was quite a handful of it, actually. It was here and there around the edges of the tent, and some was resting on top of the bag she'd brought her clothes in. Just then, Gavin poked his head in.
Hey, everything okay here?
Fine.
He was already withdrawing through the flap when she spoke again.
Gavin,
Yes?
what's this?
On the palm of her outstretched hand sat a quivering tuft of fluff.
That? It's fluff, Edna.
I know, but do you have any idea where it might have come from?
Nope. Did you check the pillows?
I haven't.
It's probably from one of them.
Said Gavin, and he smiled,
I'm gonna go finish loading up. I'll come back and help in a minute.
and he withdrew. Edna held up the fluff so she could see it closely. It was just that. Fluff. She blew it off her hand and watched it settle to the floor of the tent, where it would be swept up before the tent itself was collapsed. And she began to pack. The drive home held a wistful quality. It was the end of the summer, school would resume shortly, and some sort of routine would reassert itself. Edna looked forward to that. As much as she enjoyed them, the holidays were exhausting, though it would only be a handful of years, she realized, before the boys were old enough for summer jobs and would no longer care to spend as much time together. She should enjoy it now while she could. She turned and looked at them. The older one, Josh, 10, was playing an electronic game. The younger, Felix, 8 years old, leaned against the door, his head in his hand, his cheek melting into his fingers. He looked completely sapped as he watched the world slide by. Then she saw it. Perched on the shoulder of his denim jacket was a piece of fluff. At first, this brought a smile to her lips that she should have noticed fluff earlier, and here it was again. But a moment later, she was bewitched by it. She looked away, but found herself drawn to look at it again. Where had it come from? And how had it ended up on her son's shoulder like that? She looked across at Gavin, staring ahead at the road as he drove them homewards, and she wanted to ask him what he thought, but in her head she heard the answer he gave last time and thought better of disturbing his concentration. Besides, hadn't he been right? Well, he had, hadn't he? And she looked over into the back seat again, and yes, it was. It was just fluff. Perhaps Josh had put it there. And it was nothing. Things escalated the next day. Edna was the first up. She slid her feet into her slippers, happy for a good night's rest in a proper bed, and went down to the kitchen, but for some reason was oblivious at first to all the fluff she was walking through. A fact that was easy to forgive. It was soft and yielding, and in truth was hardly noticeable to the touch, but nevertheless, when she reached the kitchen and the fluff came up to her knees, it was impossible to miss. There it was, just about everywhere. It was on the kitchen table, on the countertops, and there was even some on top of the fridge.
Gavin,
She shouted from the bottom of the stairs.
come and have a look at this.
Gavin appeared half a minute later, scratching his head and rubbing his eyes.
What?
He said,
Well,
and Edna held out her arms to the fluff.
do you have any idea where this had come from?
Gavin surveyed the kitchen as if it was just any old place and said,
What do you want me to say, Edna? It's fluff. So the kitchen's full of fluff. It happens.
and he dug his fingers into his eyes.
Listen, I'm gonna go back to bed. I gotta go to work tomorrow and I'm gonna catch up on some shut-eye, okay?
And he disappeared upstairs. Edna couldn't believe it. The house was full of fluff. It was completely full of fluff, and Gavin didn't seem to give a darn. How had it got there? Where had it come from? And how could you get rid of it? But incredibly and unbelievably, for all the rest of the day, no one in the family or any of the neighbors seemed to care. None of them even seemed to notice that the world, their whole world, had become engulfed in fluff overnight. Because there it was, covering the outside as well. Big, thick layer coating everything. Flower beds, driveways, cars, roads, the works. Putting away the camping stuff was dastardly work. Making dinner was next to impossible. The food itself was inundated with the stuff and tasted terrible. But try as she might, she couldn't get anyone to acknowledge that anything was wrong. They just kept giving her funny looks and asking if she felt all right. Helping the boys with their baths was an exercise in absurdity, as each in his turn merely sat in a great soupy wad of the sopping wet stuff, and drying them off merely spread the stuff across their bodies like paste. When she tried to pick it off, each of them squirmed and cried out, "Mom, don't!" It was certainly the most horrific night before the start of the school year that she could remember. After the boys had slipped into their pajamas and gone downstairs to watch a little TV before bed, Edna rooted about in one of the upstairs closets, looking for clothes that she'd set aside for the boys' first day out. It was impossible to see anything through all the fluff. And what was she doing? What was happening? How could she suddenly be living in a world completely overrun with fluff? And why didn't anyone else seem to notice or care? She was almost certain, as certain as anything, that she hadn't gone mad. That was when she heard Gavin's voice mumbling into the phone downstairs, saying,
No, Mom, she just hasn't been right since we got back from camping. Do you think we could come over tomorrow and see what you think?
Later that evening, Gavin spoke to her.
Hey, your mom's coming over tomorrow, okay?
Sure.
Said Edna, but she couldn't keep his eyes. Sure enough, the next morning, after Gavin had gone to work, and she saw the boys off to school, Edna's mother stopped by. The two of them sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, fluff floating on the top of it, and Edna's mother said, "Honey, Gavin spoke to me last night. He said you were a bit out of sorts. He wondered if it was something I could help you with. Do you want to talk?" Edna took a sip of coffee and prized a bit of fluff from between her teeth. She sighed.
It's the fluff, Mom.
But Edna's mother rolled her eyes. "Fluff," she said with a wave of her hand. "What's a little fluff? So the world is full of fluff. What's the big deal? Get used to it. You've always been like this, Edna. Always going on about this and that. Please, honey, just accept it. Everyone else does. Enjoy these few years before your boys grow so old they don't want to know you anymore." Edna looked at her mother.
I've always been like this?
She asked quietly. "Always." And Edna's mother reached across the table through the fluff, took Edna's hand in hers and said, "Edna, honey, when are you going to start to learn to accept things just as they are? There isn't a blessed thing anyone can do about it. Listen to your mother. A little fluff never hurt anyone." Two more fluff. They weren't there for him. It always came back to this. He might have reacted any number of ways, but when he really needed the money, when having a car would have made all the difference, when a little understanding would have helped, this was where he felt the whole of his extended family let him down. Friends as well, mostly. Teachers, employers too. He might have reacted any number of ways. Some people became saints. Others festered. He was a festerer. Ronald Reginald Gavin Baines, 23, had the nature that could wither a monument, try the patience of a telephone pole. On the day in question, he was on his way to buy a little bag of illicit weed. He'd just been on the phone with his mother about her birthday dinner, which was coming up. He'd have to miss it, he said. Could she spot him 100? She couldn't, she said. Please, he said, having learned a little wheedling politeness along the way. No, she said. Come on, Mom, just this once. Just this once. Did I hear you say just this once? Oh, good Lord, I don't believe it. What? Oh, go soak your head, Ronald Reginald. From here, the conversation deteriorated rather quickly, and Ronald Reginald set off on his crappy old bike. To get where he was going, Ronald Reginald had to cut along the paved footpath running in behind the mall. It was a scrappy sort of path, with brush and scrub lining both sides, perfect for concealing whatever nonsense it is people get up to. And some kind of nonsense it must have been, because as Ronald sailed along on his bike on that particular bright and beautiful afternoon, he saw something emerge from an especially gnarly clump of bushes. Something tall and pale and very naked mannish looking, which is what it was, a naked man. As Ronald drew nearer, his eyebrows went up. What a sight. And what did Ronald make of this? Did he consider the man might have been mugged and deprived of his clothing? That he might have been having a bad trip on one substance or another? Or that he was suffering some kind of mental disturbance? If Ronald thought any of this, it sure didn't show. He blew past the man on his bike as quick as you can say, "Not my problem." In fact, he may have even muttered those exact words under his breath as he flew by, while at some subconscious level wondering whether his own skin looked anywhere near as sickly white, which it did. A minute later, he gained the end of the footpath and was zipping quietly towards the river. At the river, he was to be tested again. Not that this was how he thought about such things. No, he was, as ever, seeing the passing of time through a blanket of woe is me, with the caveat that at this godforsaken moment there was at least the possibility of a big fat joint to dull the edges somewhat, to ease the terrible weight of some of life's harsher injustices. At the river, two men were fighting on the grass. Each had the other by the collar, and together they were swinging about wildly, while a third man looked on and a fourth tentatively approached. The third man seemed to have something to do with it all, because as Ronald Reginald swooped by, he heard this man assure the one who was approaching, saying to him, "It's okay, they're friends." An odd assertion to make when clearly one man's fist means to connect with another's lip, and does, splitting it, the blood squirting as if from a ketchup pad. Did Ronald Reginald stop? Did he even slow? Did he reach for his cell phone? Well, no, of course not. Silly question. The battery was running low. It might be needed later. Onward he went, towards his clandestine little purchase, veering however many inches further from the fracas as he possibly could. Nothing to do with me? Lord, no. Not my problem. Seconds later, he was too far away to make any sense of the words flying up at him from behind. Something like, "I'll gut you, you bastard!" or some other such pleasantry, as might be shared between friends. Next, passing through the parking lot outside the No Frills, he smiled as he watched some healthy, able-bodied lout step from a pickup truck lodged in a parking space clearly demarcated for the handicapped. "There you go," thought Ronald Reginald. "That's how it's done." And as he zipped along, he grinned lavishly at the turd of a man who Ronald felt he recognized as possessing the wherewithal to push any and every old lady into a fountain. The far side of the parking lot was George Street. The ride along the sidewalk here was short, a few blocks only. One woman seemed bothered by his little transgression, but hell be damned if he was going to walk when he had a bike, and there was no way he was going to ride in a one-way street with all the traffic going the other way. He nearly knocked over the alms cup of a man who'd settled himself half sticking out of an empty storefront. "Ha ha," said Ronald Reginald in acknowledgement of his swerving skills. It was then he spied a wallet. Someone must have just dropped it, as it was sitting squarely in the middle of the pavement for all to see. Only it was Ronald Reginald who saw it. He hit the brakes and stopped alongside. He bent over and scooped it up, then flipped it into his pocket in the blink of an avaricious eye. "Ho ho," thought Ronald Reginald, "you just never know, see?" And in a minute, round the corner, tucked away in a little walkway, with no one there to see, he pulled the wallet out and yanked it open to find out what he'd caught. With widening eyes, he pulled out a great knot of 20s. Under his breath, he growled, "That's more like it," and launched the wallet with its glut of cards and ID into a bin that seemed to be waiting there for just this purpose. He was coming round to thinking maybe he'd hunt down some OxyContin instead when his phone rang. "Shit," he said, and decided not to answer it. Better to get away from where he was first. And away he went. The ride towards his dealer was like no other, because at that moment his universe changed. And Ronald Reginald Gavin Baines found himself riding down a street that felt like it might have been in the middle of a toilet paper commercial. It began with one insignificant speck of fluff, followed by another and another. And before Ronald Reginald could even wonder what the hell was going on, there were great clumps of the stuff falling down on him with no time to even decide whether this was his problem or not. It was like being in an immense goose down whiter. His phone rang again. It was his mother. He could barely hear her. "Where are you?" she said. "What?" said Ronald Reginald, by now shouting. "I'd like it if we—" "Holy shit, Mom, I'm drowning here." "No need to be rude. Where are you?" "I'm lost," he screamed into his phone. "Lost!" With a fluff now beginning to fill his mouth. His mother said, "Well, don't worry. We'll sort it all out later. If I know you, the effects should wear off by the time you need some place to straighten out. I'll expect you then." And she hung up. Ronald Reginald found he could barely blink, his eyes so clogged with fluff. Before long, it was well over his head. Three. Fluff's End. The climb was grueling, much more his thing than hers. He'd said a ride in the country, and she'd envisioned something on the whole much flatter. But this hill, this climb to the top of the ridge, it was almost more than she could make the bike do, and she considered herself to be both fit and willing. In the lowest gear, she was out of the saddle, her legs hesitating each time they pulled the cranks over, nearly stalling with each half revolution. The strain verged on misery, yet she carried on, her eyes on the figure of him growing smaller as he pulled farther and farther ahead, already near the top. She'd be damned if he got to wait there, only to see her walk her bike up the last hill. But when she finally gained the top, not only was he not there, she saw there was still more. A steep dip followed by another short climb, the pavement now giving way to gravel. He, of course, was just arriving at the top of this further challenge, where he stopped and turned back to see how she was making out.
Great.
She thought. Her chest continued to heave, trying to draw in more air. Then, for a little, gravity began to work in her favor. From the corner of her eye, hurtling downhill, she caught another of the weathered signs they'd seen posted all over these quiet roads. Stop the wind turbines, they all said. They must have passed a dozen or more of these. When she at last arrived at the spot where he'd put his foot down, at the top of the second climb, she said between gasps,
I bet you didn't tell me about that because you knew I would have backed out.
her heart was pounding.
That?
He said,
That's a good climb, but nothing compared to some of the others around here. There's a worse one up ahead.
he said, smiling.
Oh, lovely.
You want to stop for a bit before we get to it? There's a nice little area up ahead. The ride's incredible from there.
It's gravel.
Well, yeah, but look.
He said, gesturing above at the enormous trees lining both sides of the road.
And behind you.
She turned and had to admit the view was stunning. Rolling hills and patchwork fields, the 4-lane highway in the distance, little more than a thin gray slash cutting almost unnoticeably through the varied greens. For a gravel road, it was very smooth, hardly pitted at all, with most of the stone pushed to the road's edges,
It's lovely.
she said, as they rode along, now side by side again.
The trees almost reach together at the top.
See?
He said,
Wasn't it worth the climb?
No.
she said.
Excuse me, why are these things measured against each other? Nothing was worth that climb.
Don't you think it makes it more beautiful? Having to work for it?
She was silent for a moment, just riding, then partially conceded.
Maybe. But if that's the case, then it should be more beautiful for me than for you. My God, look at that. Can you imagine living up here 100, 150 years ago? Carving out all this?
There were small fields to either side now.
Who would do that?
Different times.
Have to be pretty desperate.
See up ahead? That corner?
Yeah.
We'll stop around the bend.
It was a small cemetery, long unused. The headstones lay flat on the grass, the carving so worn it was impossible to make out any of the names, perhaps 20 stones in all. The place was wide and green, much wider than it needed to be, but was looked after and felt more peaceful than anyone might have had a right to expect. On one side was a knot of young trees hedged in by low growth. Behind and to the remaining side was an open field, spread out under the sun. Across the road was a different story. A tall chain-link fence stretched in either direction for a good distance. Behind the fence, at wide intervals, stood half a dozen towers, uncrowned by the blades and generators they were built to hold. It looked as if it had been some time since work had stopped. The grass was tall, and the nearest tower showed signs of rust and was splashed on their lowest reaches with crude, indecipherable graffiti in monochromatic red. At the moment, there wasn't the merest suggestion of a breeze.
They don't seem real.
What? Those?
The scale. Just so impossibly huge.
They lay on the grass, the two of them, only a few steps from where they'd lowered their bikes. Between them, they passed a water bottle and a packet of sesame snaps.
It's a shame.
He said, glancing across the road.
All that?
For a minute or two, they traced their fingers over the surfaces of the gravestones, able to make sense of nothing.
And who are you down there?
She said quietly, gently tapping the stone.
Wouldn't you like to tell us your story?
I don't think we're the company they've been waiting for.
But having said this, he reconsidered.
Maybe we are.
I like it here. It's a good spot. So still.
He reached over and put a hand on her shoulder.
Sorry about the hills.
He said.
No, you're not.
She smiled.
You're not in the least bit sorry.
Oh, maybe. Maybe not.
Before long, they were on their feet again, smoothing hands over legs and arms, ridding themselves of whatever tried to cling to their riding gear. They righted their bikes and wheeled them across the road, hobbling awkwardly in their cycling shoes. As they neared the fence, they were able to make out the writing on a small red sign spaced out along its length. The words said, "Danger due to..." Beneath the words was an empty space, a white box. whatever was meant to be warned against was never filled in. The grasses were thicker here and cut uncomfortably at their calves and ankles. Reaching the fence, the two leaned against it and slipped their fingers through the links. At once, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air stirred. The idea of a breeze began to lurk through the abandoned towers, and rising on it, as if having awaited this moment, were countless tufts of small white fluff lifting silently into the air. The two looked at each other.
Huh.
Snow and summer.
They stood where they were, watching the progress of the fluff as it made its way towards them.
We should go.
Not yet.
She said.
In a minute?
He admitted it was unaccountably beautiful, but said once again that they should probably be on their way. They waited, the fluff hanging, almost dangling on the slowly moving air. When the first of it reached the fence and began to slip through, it was nearly impossible to sense the air moving at all. One tuft latched itself to her helmet. Another opted for his arm. The one that landed on her shirt, just inches above her heart, he collected between two fingers and held up for her to see.
Make a wish.
I hope the next hill is flat.
You said it out loud. I don't think it's supposed to work when you do that.
Well, don't worry. I know I'm not getting out of this, am I? Wish or no wish.
They wheeled the bikes out to the road, straddled them, and began to clip themselves into the pedals.
Crap.
What?
I've got a flat.
She said.
Oh,
He said, unclipping his shoe.
I bet for just an instant you felt a moment of relief, didn't you?
They returned to the smooth grass of the cemetery, where he turned her bike upside down, removed her wheel, and set to work pulling the tire from the rim. All about them, in all directions, wherever they looked, there was fluff, slowly stealing its way across these silent uplands, touching everything.
So I am taking the script from the show that we're doing tonight, all 3 acts, and I'm going through it in order. So I even put up a Fluff Stories poster first as kind of a placeholder for a kind of title page for what I'm doing, and for the stories itself. And then I'm kind of going in a left to right so that I'm not necessarily following a narrative, but I'm redacting words from the script. So sometimes they'll follow the narrative of the script itself. Other times, if I start with a certain word, I have to reckon with that word now because I don't have another copy of the script. Okay. So if I start with a certain word, I kind of have to just try to make something seem either organic, again, in terms of narrative or not. So some end up being kind of like very airy, kind of surreal poems. Other ones just kind of might follow the narrative of one of those kind of surreal poems. But really, I mean, what it would boil down to is just trying to make what I leave out of the redaction, make it interesting. That's all I'm trying to do. Interesting per page, though, so not sequentially. one page doesn't necessarily flow into the other, what I'm doing. If I put another one at the bottom, one at the top, and two in the middle, it actually works perfectly with the amount of pages the script is. And I think it's nice to have the event posters in the middle.
Yeah.
So this is script 1. This is what I did yesterday, which Elisha just nicely kind of took aside for me. Took all the tape off and made it into, put them in order again, which is nice because Joe already has the page numbers there. So I think I'll give this to Joe if he wants it, maybe both.